The sun was setting slowly over the small, well-trimmed lawns of suburban Texas neighborhood where Ethan Miller had lived his entire life. The narrow streets, lined with identical mailboxes and stars and stripes flags fluttering gently on porches, felt more like a stage than a home that evening. Every corner of the neighborhood echoed with a quiet expectation of conformity. Behind the closed doors of one particular house at the end of Rockwood Drive, something much less orderly was unraveling. Inside, the Miller residence was filled with the smell of something fried and overcooked as usual. The living room, dimly lit, displayed an almost obsessive dedication to Robert Miller's military past. Framed medals, faded photos of him in uniform, and a giant American flag in a glass case hanging above the fireplace. It was a house of duty, silence, and deeply buried emotions. Seated on the worn leather couch, Ethan rubbed his hands together, tried to warm his palms, though it wasn't cold. At 17, his body was lean and tall, his face still holding the last traces of boyhood. But tonight, there was something in his eyes, an exhaustion that didn't belong to a teenager. He heard his father's heavy boots step into the living room and turned slightly. Robert stood with the authority of a man who'd spent 2 decades giving and taking orders. His flannel shirt was tucked in with military precision, and his jaw clenched like he was already bracing for a blow. "You wanted to talk," Robert said, his voice low, uninterested. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned. "Yeah," he replied, barely louder than a whisper. I need to tell you something." Robert's arms crossed. His face showed no emotion, just the usual expectation of compliance. Ethan stood. His knees trembled, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm gay, Dad." Silence exploded in the room. For a long second, Robert didn't move, didn't blink. Then he walked over to the mantel, stared at the flag, and sighed through his nose. "You sure?" he asked, turning his back. Ethan blinked, stunned by the question. "Yes." Robert nodded, slow and mechanical. Then he turned, his face hard, unreadable. "I raised you to be a man. I gave you structure, respect, discipline. I taught you how to stand up straight, how to lead, how to fight. And now you tell me this? This is me standing up straight," Ethan said, suddenly finding a crack of strength in his voice. "This is me telling the truth." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You've always been soft. Your mother said it was sensitivity. I said it was weakness." Ethan's chest tightened. "It's not weakness. It takes more strength to say this than you'll ever know." Robert's words dropped like steel. "I'll never be proud of you." The sentence cut the air in half. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just nodded once and turned to walk away. That was the moment something broke cleanly in his chest. Not shattered, but severed, like a final rope cut from a sinking ship. Upstairs, he packed in silence. A duffel bag, a few clothes, his high school notebooks, the photo of his mother, who had died when he was 13, tucked into a side pocket. He didn't take much. There wasn't much he wanted. He paused at the threshold of his room, taking one last look. The posters on the wall, military planes, a Marine Corps recruitment banner. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once wanted to be just like his father. Now, he wanted only to become himself. The front door creaked as he opened it. The last bit of sunlight touched his face. As he stepped out, Robert remained inside, silent. No word of protest. No goodbye. Outside, the world felt bigger and colder. He walked down the street with no idea where he would sleep that night, only knowing that he couldn't stay. He didn't look back. That night, he lay on the couch of his best friend, Marcus. The ceiling fan clicked rhythmically above him, and every noise felt louder in the dark. He couldn't sleep, not because he was scared of the future, but because he was mourning a father who was still alive. And yet, under that grief, something strange and fierce began to grow. He had left behind a man who couldn't accept him, but he hadn't left behind himself. That was the beginning. He didn't know it yet, but walking out of that house wasn't just leaving. It was marching toward a battle of a different kind, one that would demand every ounce of strength he had, and he would not walk it quietly. The days after Ethan left home bled into one another with an ache that was quiet but constant, like a low-grade fever that never quite broke. Living on Marcus's couch wasn't sustainable, though his friend never made him feel like a burden. Still, Ethan could sense in the way Marcus's parent avoided looking him in the eye during breakfast, and how his bag always seemed to be in the way no matter where he put it, in the unspoken discomfort that sat in the corners of the living room like a second, invisible guest. He understood. They were good people, but their kindness had an expiration date. By the end of that summer, Ethan had picked up a job at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled permanently of burnt espresso and cleaning fluid. He worked the early shift during weekdays and doubled on weekends. The pay was barely enough to cover his half of the rent when he eventually moved into a shared studio with 2 community college students he barely knew. The air mattress he bought secondhand had a slow leak he could never locate, and most nights, he woke up on the cold floor with a sore back and a deeper exhaustion than sleep could fix. He didn't speak to his father. Not once. The silence was mutual and unbroken. Some nights he replayed their last conversation, word for word, trying to find a way he could have said it differently. Other nights he refused to think about it at all. Survival consumed his energy now. Paying rent, stretching groceries, keeping his hours up. There was no room for regret in a routine he built out of necessity. But despite everything, despite the loneliness, the exhaustion, the gnawing anxiety that came with not knowing what tomorrow looked like, Ethan felt more like himself than ever before. It was a quiet realization, buried under fatigue and uncertainty. But it was real. He had taken the first honest step of his life. That counted for something. The idea of enlisting returned to him slowly, not as a fantasy of escape or validation, but as something rooted in discipline, in proving to himself, not to his father, that he could shape a life of his own. The military had once been a symbol of his father's control, but now it took on a new meaning, structure, purpose, and maybe even freedom on his own terms. He spent nights reading everything he could about enlistment requirements, physical training standards, and the culture within the armed forces. He knew the risks, especially as a young gay man. He'd heard stories, but something in him had hardened, grown less afraid. On his 18th birthday, he walked alone into the recruitment office. The sergeant behind the desk, a broad man with tired eyes and a polite smile, asked the usual questions. Ethan answered without flinching, signing the paperwork with the kind of calm that only comes after surviving much worse. Basic training was brutal. The days started before dawn and ended well after the sun had disappeared, with screaming instructors and relentless physical demands. Ethan was not the strongest in his unit, but he was the most determined. What he lacked in brute power, he made up for in precision and endurance. The other recruits noticed. So did the staff. His bunkmate, Jackson Hayes, was the first to offer something resembling friendship. A tall, soft-spoken boy from Michigan, Jackson had a laugh that didn't match his serious face, and a habit of humming old country songs when he thought no one was listening. They didn't talk much at first, too tired, too focused, but there was a mutual respect that grew slowly. When Jackson found out Ethan was gay, his response was a simple shrug. "You're squared away," he said, cleaning his boots one evening. "That's what matters." Others followed suit. A few made stupid jokes at first, but they were short-lived. Ethan proved himself not through words, but through effort, consistency, and grit. During drills, he was focused. In group tasks, reliable. When one of the recruits twisted his ankle during a timed run, Ethan doubled back without thinking, helping him limp the last stretch, even though it cost them both their personal records. That moment sealed something within the unit, an unspoken pact of loyalty. The night they graduated from basic training, Ethan stood in uniform for the first time, the insignia still new and unfamiliar on his chest. The weight of it didn't come from the fabric, but from everything it represented. Months of struggle, sacrifice, and silent victories. His father wasn't there. He didn't expect him to be. But as he stood in formation, he didn't feel empty. He felt ready. Deployment orders came faster than expected. His unit was being sent abroad for a humanitarian operation that, according to command, had turned unexpectedly volatile. Details were scarce, but Ethan didn't need specifics to know it would be dangerous. The nights before departure were filled with silent preparations, last calls home, and the kind of nervous energy that buzzed in the bones. Ethan didn't call Robert. He had nothing left to say. Before boarding the transport aircraft, Jackson clapped him on the shoulder. "We come back together," he said. "Deal." Ethan nodded, voice tight. "Deal." As the engines roared to life and the desert horizon came into view, Ethan felt a familiar churn of fear in his gut. But layered over was something else, a purpose born not of obedience, but a choice. He had walked into this life freely, and now, with the world watching, he would carry it forward on his own terms. He didn't know then what was waiting on the other side of the ocean, only that it would test him in ways even he couldn't imagine, and he would meet it head-on. The heat was the first thing Ethan noticed when they landed. Thick, oppressive, and clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. It filled his lungs with every breath, the dust of the desert clinging to his gear, coating his throat, and leaving a bitter film in his mouth. Their base was little more than a cluster of reinforced tents and makeshift barracks surrounded by endless miles of flat, beige nothing. There was no real town nearby, only the vague outlines of abandoned villages and the occasional plume of smoke rising in the distance. The mission briefing was terse and full of warnings. They were there to provide support during the evacuation of civilian families caught between two warring factions. An unstable ceasefire had broken, and chaos had moved in to fill the gap. Ethan's unit had been assigned to secure a small evacuation corridor on the edge of a town that barely appeared on satellite maps. The intelligence was vague, but the risk was clear. Tensions were high. No one knew who they could trust. The line between combatant and civilian was blurred at best. In the early hours of the morning, under a sky that was too dark for comfort, Ethan and his team were deployed to the edge of the corridor. The town, or what was left of it, was a crumbling maze of sand-colored stone and corrugated metal. With windows blown out and alleys too narrow to see through clearly, they moved cautiously, sweeping buildings, checking rooftops, listening for any sign of movement beyond their own. It was supposed to be routine. Get in, secure the route, and guide the civilians to the extraction point. But routine vanished the moment the first shot rang out. The sound cracked the air in half. Then came another, then 5 more. Chaos erupted. Screams. Static filled orders over the comms. Dust clouds kicked up from sudden movements, and the world narrowed to a blur of shouted commands and staccato rhythm of gunfire. Ethan's sergeant, Lieutenant Reed, took a round to the shoulder during the initial exchange. Blood bloomed through his uniform, and he went down hard behind a broken wall. Panic surged through the group. Without Reed, they were a unit without a head, and the fire wasn't letting up. It was Ethan who crawled to him, who pressed his hands to the wound while Reed hissed through clenched teeth. "You're in charge now," Reed gasped. "Get them out." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Ethan's hands trembled as he looked around at the faces turned toward him, young, scared, waiting. He felt the weight of it hit his chest like a second bullet. He had trained for this. He had run the drills, studied the tactics, memorized the protocols. But nothing in a classroom could prepare him for this. The dust, the blood, the screaming, the chaos clawing at every corner of his mind. For a moment, everything slowed, the sounds dulled, his vision tunneled. He felt the heat, the fear, the impossible responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. And in that split second, he considered freezing. He considered running. He considered letting someone else make the call. That would have been easier. That would have been safer. But something deeper pushed through the noise. A memory, a promise, a voice that had once told him he wasn't enough, and the quiet, stubborn fire that had driven him to prove otherwise ever since. His jaw tightened. His breathing steadied. "Cover fire, left flank," he shouted. "Briggs, Hayes, secure the civilians, move them 2 by 2. Alvarez, with me, we're clearing the north alley." The orders came fast, sharp, and for the first time in that firefight, the chaos bent around structure. They moved as a unit again. Ethan led from the front, darting between cover, firing when necessary, dragging one of the wounded back with the help of another soldier. They found the civilians, terrified, huddled in the back of a half-collapsed building, and started the evacuation under fire. One of the last to emerge was a girl, no older than 6, her face streaked with soot and tears. She stood frozen while bullets tore into the walls above her head. Without hesitation, Ethan ran to her, lifted her into his arms, and shielded her with his body as he moved. Every step felt like a lifetime. Dust in his mouth, heat in his veins. The world narrowed again, but this time with focus, not fear. He reached the extraction point seconds before the helicopter touched down. The wind from the rotors whipped sand into his eyes, but he didn't stop. He carried the girl aboard, handed her to the medic, and turned back toward the chaos. But the mission was complete. Everyone who could be saved had made it out, and Ethan had done it. Back at base, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. He sat alone outside the barracks that night, still in his uniform, still covered in blood and dust, staring at nothing. The adrenaline had drained, leaving behind something cold and heavy. Jackson found him there, pulled up a crate, and sat without saying anything for a long time. "You did good," Jackson finally said. Ethan shook his head. "I almost froze." "But you didn't," Jackson replied. "That's what matters." They sat in silence again, a different kind of silence, the kind that acknowledges pain without trying to fix it. The next morning, word came down through command. Ethan's actions had been noted, his leadership under fire, the civilian lives saved, the injured recovered, all of it documented and passed along. He didn't know what it meant yet. He didn't care. Recognition felt distant, irrelevant. What stayed with him was a look in that little girl's eyes, the raw, unspoken trust, and the sound of the helicopter lifting off behind him as the town burned in the distance. He had almost given up. Almost. But he didn't. And that, in the end, was everything. Washington, D.C. hummed with its usual bureaucratic rhythm, a city built on ceremony and quiet calculation. But on this particular morning, the energy around the defense hall was something different, tighter, expectant. The building, flanked by flags and guarded by men in crisp uniforms, was dressed for spectacle. Rows of folding chairs filled with family members, military personnel, and journalists created a controlled sea of order. Cameras were being adjusted, badges clipped, rehearsals whispered behind podiums. And at the center of it all, his name, Ethan Miller, now 23, stood behind a heavy curtain backstage, adjusting the collar of his formal dress uniform. The commendation was official, a medal of heroism. It had taken months of the military to process the reports, verify the footage, and filter through the accounts of what happened in that desert corridor. He had remained quiet through all of it, refusing every interview, declining every spotlight. He hadn't done it to be seen. He had done it because it was right. And yet here he was, minutes away from stepping onto a stage where hundreds would see him for what he'd become, a soldier, a leader, and, in the eyes of many, a hero. A young officer checked on him briefly, clipboard in hand, whispering about timing and posture and the order of things. Ethan nodded absently. He had run into bullets and fire with more calm than he felt now. Public attention was not something he craved. He wasn't built for applause, but he respected the way of the moment. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone he had carried out of that chaos, everyone who didn't get a stand on this stage. As the announcer's voice filled the hall, Ethan steadied his breath. He stepped forward and emerged into the light of the auditorium, the polished floors gleaming beneath his boots. Applause rose, polite but sustained. He walked with practiced calm, his gaze fixed ahead, until something stopped him mid-stride. Not his feet, but somewhere deeper in his chest. There, in the last row, nearly hidden in shadow, sat a man who should not have been there, Robert Miller. His father, the same rigid posture, the same military cut. But something had changed. His shoulders, once ironclad with authority, seemed smaller. His face, once impenetrable, now carried something fragile around the eyes. He looked older than Ethan remembered, not in years, but in something more permanent. Regret, maybe, or loss. Ethan's steps didn't falter. He didn't let the emotion rise. He had trained for this too, control. But his heart beat harder against his chest. His throat tightened. He returned his gaze to the front, climbed the steps, and stood before the commander who would deliver the medal. The speech was short. Commendations, valor, leadership under fire, lives saved, the kind of language that sanitized chaos, that polished horror into heroism. Ethan stood still as the medal was placed around his neck, the weight of it surprisingly cold. Applause followed again, louder this time. Cameras flashed. But Ethan didn't hear any of it. Not really. His ears were tuned to something else. The memory of silence in a kitchen years ago. A voice saying words that had never left him. And now, just rose away. The same voice sat mute, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on him as if seeing him for the first time. After the ceremony, people came to shake his hand. Officials with medals of their own. Generals who smiled for photos. Soldiers who nodded with quiet respect. Ethan moved through it all like a shadow, polite but distant. His thoughts were already somewhere else. He stepped off the stage, into the aisle, and without hesitation walked toward the last row. Robert stood as he approached, uncertain, his hands clasped in front of him like he wasn't sure what they should do. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, father and son, uniform to uniform, history heavy between them. "I didn't expect you," Ethan said, voice low. "I didn't expect to be here," Robert replied, and then quickly added, "But I needed to be." The air between them was tight, not hostile, just full of everything that had never been said. Robert's eyes were glassy. His mouth opened, then closed. He glanced away, then back. I saw the footage. Of the mission, I read the reports. Ethan nodded slowly, uncertain of what to say to that. Robert swallowed hard. You were brave." He paused, like each word cost him something. "More than I ever was." That hit Ethan harder than he expected. Not because it sounded like praise, but because it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded real. Human. Broken. The silence stretched again. Ethan looked at his father. Really looked. And saw not the man who had driven him away, but someone older, quieter, perhaps haunted by choices he could no longer defend. "I didn't come here for forgiveness," Robert added, barely audible now. "I came to see who you become." Ethan stood straighter, not out of pride, but from something steadier than anger. He nodded once tight, then reached out, not for a handshake, but to place a hand briefly on his father's shoulder. "Then I'm glad you did." Neither of them spoke after that. There were no apologies, no declarations. Just two men, standing in the quiet aftermath of a long war neither of them had truly understood until now. Ethan walked away before the moment could collapse under the weight of expectation. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because something had finally shifted, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had something to prove. The late afternoon sun painted the marble steps outside the defense hall in golden shadow as the ceremony dispersed, attendees filtering slowly into waiting cars and quiet conversations. Ethan stood alone near the back of the building, away from the cameras, away from the congratulations, his dress uniform still pristine despite the weight it carried. His fingers traced lightly over the edge of the medal on his chest, but his thoughts were not on commendations or speeches. They were still lingering in that final row of the auditorium where Robert Miller had sat, silent and shaken. He hadn't expected to feel anything in that moment. He had thought himself insulated, armored not by the uniform but by years of distance. But when his eyes had met his father's, something had moved, small, subtle, but undeniable. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, something more fragile, a beginning, maybe, or the ghost of one. He turned the corner of the building and found Robert standing alone by a side entrance, as if unsure whether he was supposed to leave or wait. The older man looked up at the sound of Ethan's footsteps, and his face, always a fortress, betrayed something like vulnerability, not shame, not pride, something quieter, hesitation. Ethan stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was thick, not with tension, but with all the words that had gone unsaid for too many years. "You came all the way from Texas," Ethan said finally, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Robert nodded. "Didn't think I would," he admitted, "but when I saw your name in the news, I could not come." Ethan nodded, absorbing the honesty in that awkward confession. "It's been 5 years." "I know." The quiet stretched again, but Ethan didn't feel it this time. He let it breathe. He had learned, over the years, that some silences meant more than words ever could. And yet, this one was different. It wasn't enough to leave it hanging. "I used to think," he said slowly, That one day I'd do something big enough to make you take it back. What you said to me that night. Robert looked down, his jaw tight. I remember every word, he said, voice rough. And I hate myself for all of them. I don't need you to take them back, Ethan continued, softer now. Not anymore. I've spent too long trying to erase that night. But it happened, and I'm still here. Robert's gaze returned to him, and there was something unsteady in it. I was wrong, he said carefully, as if each syllable were fragile. Not just about you, about myself, about what I thought mattered, about what it meant to be proud. Ethan inhaled deeply, the city noise a distant hum around them. You don't have to say anything else. But Robert shook his head, stepping closer. I do. I should have said it years ago. You're braver than I ever was. Not just in uniform. In life, I didn't understand that before. I didn't understand. I thought discipline was enough. That duty would define a man. But watching you today, hearing what you did, seeing who you are, I realized I never really knew you. And that's on me. His voice broke slightly, and for the first time Ethan had ever seen, his father looked like he might cry. I was proud of the idea of a son, Robert said, almost a whisper now. But I never earned the right to be proud of the man standing in front of me. Ethan didn't move at first. His chest was tight, not with anger, but with a quiet, complicated ache of recognition. He thought of that version of himself, 17 and scared, walking into the night alone. He thought of the boy who'd wanted nothing more than a different ending to that last conversation. And then he thought of now, of everything that had come between. He stepped forward and embraced his father. There were no words between them in that instant, no justifications or apologies, just a long, trembling exhale and two arms that had never known how to hold each other properly. Robert gripped his son like he was holding something both fragile and sacred, and Ethan, for the first time, didn't feel like he was reaching backward for something lost. He was holding something new. When they finally separated, Ethan didn't step back far. He met his father's eyes and said, quietly but firmly, "It's okay. I'm proud enough for both of us." Robert's face folded into itself, not with shame, but with the collapse of years he hadn't known how to carry. He nodded, unable to speak, eyes shining with everything he could no longer bury. There were no promises that day, no declarations of future dinners or holidays spent together, no illusion that they could pick up where they left off, because there was nothing there to pick up. What existed now was something else, a beginning that did not try to rewrite the past, but instead made space for what could come next. Ethan walked away with his head high, not because he'd been seen, but because he had stopped needing to be. He no longer measured his worth by a father's acceptance or a nation's applause. His strength came from having survived without either, and still choosing, even now, to love without condition. That afternoon, long after the crowd had disappeared and the sun began to dip behind the government buildings, Ethan sat on a quiet bench near the National Mall. A few tourists passed by, oblivious of the weight of the moment. He looked down at the medal resting against his chest, then at the world moving indifferently around him. He smiled, not for the cameras, not for approval, just for himself. Because somewhere out there, another boy would find the courage to walk out a house that didn't see him. Another soldier would step into uniform afraid, but not alone. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would hear the words they needed to believe. You're already enough.